Picture this. It's 1826, and you're standing at the Continental Divide, that spine of America where water decides whether it's heading to the Pacific or the Atlantic. You're looking at a landscape that would make modern wilderness enthusiasts pack up their gear and head home. We're talking about peaks that scrape 13,000 feet into thin air, valleys that could swallow entire cities, and weather systems that can kill you in July. Now here's what gets me about this moment in history. A woman named Martha Young is about to become the first white woman to cross this divide. Not just cross it. She's leading 17 wagons full of families through South Pass, Wyoming. 17 wagons. That's roughly 80 people looking to her for leadership through terrain that would challenge a modern four-wheel drive vehicle. Think about the audacity of that decision. Martha Young wasn't some hardened mountain woman born to the peaks. She was making choices that her grandmother couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. The maps of the time, they literally showed dragons where the Rocky Mountains stood. That wasn't poetic license. Cartographers genuinely didn't know what was out there. But here's the thing that really grabs me about the 1820s. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. Just 20 years earlier, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea had guided Lewis and Clark through these same mountain ranges. Her legacy was rippling through American consciousness like a stone thrown into still water. She'd proven something that changed everything, that these mountains could be crossed, that they could be survived, and that sometimes it took a woman to show men how to do it. The timing matters here. The 1820s were when America was having this massive identity crisis about what it meant to be American. The East Coast was civilized, sure, but the West was where you went to prove something, to yourself, to your country, to God, maybe. And women were looking at those peaks and thinking, why should men have all the proving? Narcissa Whitman understood this. So did Eliza Spaulding. In 1836, these two women were literally racing each other to be the first to cross the Rockies. Not walking, not riding in wagons. They were on horseback, racing through mountain passes that could kill them with a single misstep. Think about the competitive fire that had to burn in these women. They weren't just challenging the mountains. They were challenging every assumption about what women could do, what they should do, what they were capable of doing. But here's where the story gets really interesting. While these Anglo women were making headlines for their mountain crossings, there were other women who looked at those headlines and probably thought, what took you so long? Mexican women had been ruling mountain trading posts for decades. Maria Gertrudis Barceló, and when I say ruling, I mean ruling, controlled trade routes from Taos to Santa Fe. She wasn't just surviving in the mountains. She was teaching Anglo newcomers the economics of altitude, how to price goods when every ounce has to be carried on horseback, how to negotiate with tribes who controlled the passes, how to read weather patterns that could trap your entire trading party in a blizzard that kills everything that moves. This is what I love about history. These moments when different worlds collide and you realize that what seems like a first achievement to one group of people is just Tuesday to another. Maria Barceló had been making fortunes in those mountains, while Eastern newspapers were still debating whether women should be allowed to own property. And then there were the indigenous women, Cherokee and Arapaho women who found themselves in an impossible situation. The Trail of Tears was pushing their communities deeper and deeper into highland sanctuaries, and these women became the bridge between two worlds. They were guiding desperate white settlers through secret passes while their own people were being systematically destroyed by the same government those settlers represented. Think about that moral complexity. You're a Cherokee woman. Your people have been betrayed, murdered, marched at gunpoint from ancestral lands. And here comes a family of white settlers, lost, starving, their children crying from the cold. Do you let them die? Do you save them? These women made those choices every single day, and most of the time they chose mercy. They chose to save lives, even when those lives belonged to people who looked like their oppressors. The 1840s brought us face to face with what mountains could really do to human beings. The Donner Party tragedy, and I want you to really think about this, shows us both the absolute worst of mountain survival and some of the most incredible displays of human endurance ever recorded. Margaret Reed, remember that name? When the Donner Party got trapped in the Sierra Nevada, when the snow started falling in October and didn't stop until May, when people started making decisions that haunt American history to this day, Margaret Reed kept her children alive by boiling leather. Not just any leather, shoe leather, harness leather, anything that had once been hide. She melted snow with her own body heat when they ran out of fuel. But here's what really gets me about Margaret Reed's story. She didn't just survive. She didn't just keep her children alive. When rescue parties finally reached them, she had organized the other survivors. She had become the leader, the decision-maker, the person everyone looked to when the unthinkable became routine. And then there was Tamsen Donner. Tamsen made a different choice, and I think it's just as heroic. When rescue came, her husband was dying. She could have left with the rescue party. She could have saved herself. Instead, she chose to stay with her dying husband in that frozen hell. She chose love over life. Think about that. Think about having to make that choice. The Donner Party tragedy sent shockwaves through American consciousness, but it didn't stop women from heading to the mountains. If anything, it seemed to steel their resolve. The Mormon women who followed Brigham Young to Utah were building something unprecedented, an entire civilization in the peaks under the leadership of women like Eliza Snow. The Relief Society. That was Eliza Snow's creation, and it became the governing body for Mormon women across the Utah Territory. We're talking about a women's organization that controlled resources, made policy decisions, and determined how entire communities survived in some of the most challenging terrain on the continent. For generations, if you wanted something done in the Utah mountains, you didn't go to the territorial governor. You went to the Relief Society. But not all mountain women came by choice. Mail-order brides from Norway and Germany arrived expecting mountain paradise, based on letters that concealed brutal realities. The isolation alone could drive people insane. Imagine being a young woman from a Norwegian village, used to community, to neighbors, to human conversation, and suddenly finding yourself on a homestead where the nearest neighbor is 20 miles away and winter lasts 8 months. Most of these women probably regretted their decisions. Some went home, some went crazy, but some thrived. Greta Thorsen established the first brewery above 8,000 feet. Think about the audacity of that decision. You're isolated, you're struggling to survive, and you decide what this community really needs is beer. Good beer, German beer made at an altitude that would challenge modern brewers with all their technology. Greta Thorsen understood something that we're only beginning to appreciate today. Civilization doesn't just happen where it's easy. Civilization happens wherever human beings decide to make it happen. And sometimes it takes a woman to show everyone else what civilized actually looks like. By the end of the 1840s, something fundamental had changed in the American Mountain West. It wasn't just that women were present in the mountains. Women had been present in the mountains as long as humans had existed. It was that women were choosing the mountains. They were seeing those peaks not as barriers to be endured, but as opportunities to be seized. And that choice, that fundamental decision to see challenge as opportunity, was about to transform everything. Because the 1850s were coming, and with them the discovery of gold. And when gold fever hit the Rocky Mountains, it was going to be women who turned that fever into the foundation of American mountain civilization. The fearless had been summoned. Now they were about to prove that being fearless and being smart weren't mutually exclusive. In fact, in the mountains, they were often the same thing. The question wasn't whether women could survive in the peaks. The question was whether the peaks could survive the women who were coming for them. 1850. Gold fever hits the Rocky Mountains like a lightning strike, and suddenly every creek, every gulch, every god-forsaken piece of mountain real estate might be hiding the fortune that changes everything. But here's what gets me. About the gold rush era, while thousands of men were tearing up mountainsides looking for nuggets, it was often women who figured out the real money wasn't in the ground. It was in the pockets of the men digging. Clara Brown understood this from day one. Picture a woman born into slavery, walking, and I mean walking, 1,000 miles from Kansas to Colorado's gold fields. Not riding, not in a wagon, walking. With everything she owned on her back and a dream that most people would have called impossible. Clara Brown looked at those mining camps full of men who hadn't changed clothes in months, who were sleeping on the ground and eating beans from cans, and she saw opportunity. She set up the first laundry service in Central City, Colorado. Think about the business model here. She's charging miners premium prices to wash clothes at 10,000 feet elevation, where water freezes solid 6 months of the year. But Clara Brown was thinking bigger than laundry. She was investing her profits in real estate, in mining claims, in the infrastructure that was going to outlast the gold fever. By 1865, this woman who had been someone's property just 15 years earlier was worth $10,000. In 1865, money, that's serious wealth. That's buy your own town money. And then there was Mountain Mary Richardson. Now here's a woman who decided that if men could stake mining claims, she could stake mining claims. She found the richest vein on Mosquito Creek. And when 30 armed claim jumpers showed up in the winter of 1861 to take it from her, she showed them what dynamite could do to a person's day. Think about that confrontation. It's the middle of winter at 11,000 feet. You're one woman facing 30 armed men who think they can just take what you've worked for. Most people would have folded. Mountain Mary Richardson strapped dynamite to her chest and told those 30 men that if they took one more step, she was taking all of them with her. They believed her. 30 armed men looked at one woman with explosives and decided their lives were worth more than her gold claim. That's what I call effective negotiation. But the Chinese women's story, that's where things get really complicated. Women like Polly Bemis arrived hidden in tea crates, sold as slaves to mining camp brothels. The lucky ones bought their freedom. The really exceptional ones transformed entire communities. Polly Bemis didn't just escape slavery, she revolutionized frontier medicine. She was treating gunshot wounds, delivering babies, and curing diseases with herbal remedies that miners' wives had never heard of. Think about the cultural exchange happening here. Chinese medicine meeting frontier desperation, creating hybrid treatments that kept mining camps from dying out completely. These Chinese women established the first hospitals above 8,000 feet. Not government hospitals, not company hospitals. Private hospitals run by women who understood that if you wanted to stay alive in the mountains, you needed someone who knew how to put bodies back together when the mountains tried to kill them. Virginia City, Nevada, 1860. If you wanted to understand how the Mountain West really worked, you studied Julia Bulette. The newspapers called her the Queen of the Red Lights, which tells you what kind of business she was running. But here's what the newspapers didn't tell you. Julia Bulette was secretly funding every orphanage in Virginia City. She was nursing smallpox victims when doctors wouldn't enter contaminated buildings. She was keeping that entire community alive while they publicly shamed her for how she made her living. And when jealous competitors arranged her murder in 1867, the entire town shut down for her funeral. Miners, bankers, ministers, everyone who had pretended to disapprove of Julia Bulette showed up to honor the woman who had actually been taking care of them. That's the thing about mountain communities. They couldn't afford the luxury of conventional morality. Survival trumped respectability every single time, and the women who understood this first were the ones who built empires. Biddy Mason took a different approach. She won her freedom in California courts, then used her skills as a midwife to build relationships with every powerful family in Los Angeles. Think about the strategic brilliance here. She's delivering their babies, saving their wives' lives, becoming indispensable to people who control the economy. And while she's saving lives, she's also gathering intelligence about which land is about to become valuable. Biddy Mason was purchasing entire city blocks before the men who thought they were running loss. Angelis even knew those blocks were for sale. She was playing a longer game, thinking generationally, while everyone else was thinking about next month's profits. The Cornish women of Mineral Point, Wisconsin, were writing their own rules about what women could do underground. When their husbands descended into lead mines, these women went down with them, not to watch, to work, to dig, to haul ore, and when labor came too fast to reach the surface, they were birthing babies underground, in mine shafts, by lantern light. Think about that. Think about bringing new life into the world, in a place designed to be hostile to all life. These women were redefining what it meant to be a mother, what it meant to be a worker, what it meant to be human. Sarah Winnemucca understood that if Native women were going to survive what was happening to the Mountain West, they needed to control their own narrative. She wrote the first autobiography by a Native woman, exposing the horrors of mountain reservation life to Eastern readers who had no idea what their government was doing in their name. But Sarah Winnemucca wasn't just documenting suffering. She was building bridges. She was serving as translator, negotiator, and cultural interpreter between worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Think about the emotional toll of that work. You're watching your people being systematically destroyed while trying to find common ground with the destroyers. Chipeta, the Ute leader, was playing an even more dangerous game. She was negotiating directly with federal authorities, trying to preserve some version of traditional life while accommodating the reality that white settlement wasn't going away. These negotiations weren't happening in comfortable conference rooms. They were happening in mountain camps, where one wrong word could trigger massacres. Irish women fleeing the potato famine brought different skills to mountain communities. They understood organizing, they understood survival, and they understood that information was power. The boarding houses they established weren't just places for miners to sleep. They were intelligence networks where every conversation was monitored, every piece of gossip was catalogued. Every advantage was seized. Molly Brown's mansion in Leadville, Colorado, became the command center for what I can only call female economic warfare. These women were coordinating investments, manipulating markets, and controlling resource flow across the entire Mountain West. They were running shadow governments that actually governed, while the official governments were still figuring out how to survive at altitude. By 1870, the statistics tell an incredible story. Women owned 40% of mountain businesses. 40%. They controlled 60% of real estate. And they were birthing 80% of babies above 8,000 feet without losing more mothers than cities at sea level. Think about what those numbers mean. This wasn't women adapting to a male-dominated frontier economy. This was women creating their own economy, setting their own rules, and succeeding on their own terms in an environment that should have killed them. The mountains weren't just changing women. Women were changing the mountains. And the 1880s were about to prove that when you push mountain women too far, they don't just push back. They push back with dynamite. 1880. The Mountain West was becoming valuable, and that meant powerful men were coming to take it away from the people who had made it valuable. The Johnson County War in Wyoming was about to teach America what happened when you tried to steal from mountain women who had learned to fight with everything they had. Ella Watson. Remember that name? The newspapers called her Cattle Kate, and they made her sound like some kind of outlaw queen rustling cattle across the Wyoming territory. Here's what actually happened. Ella Watson owned a legitimate homestead. She had legal title. She was running her own operation, competing with the big cattle barons who thought they owned the entire Mountain West. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association decided Ella Watson was a problem that needed solving. So they solved her. They dragged her from her cabin and hanged her from a cottonwood tree for the crime of refusing to sell her land to men who wanted to steal it. But here's what the cattle barons didn't understand about mountain women. When you murder one of them, you don't intimidate the others. You radicalize them. Elizabeth Libby Custer, and yes, that Custer, the general's widow, took Ella Watson's murder and turned it into a rallying cry for every woman who had ever been told to step aside for men with money. She organized what she called widows' brigades, and these weren't social clubs. These were armed women who rode through mountain communities, spreading the word that what happened to Ella Watson could happen to any of them. Think about the courage that took. Libby Custer was a respectable Eastern widow who could have lived comfortably on her husband's military pension. Instead, she chose to become a fugitive, organizing resistance to corporate power in some of the most dangerous territory in America. Ann Bassett took a different approach. They called her the Queen of the Rustlers, and she earned that title by stealing cattle from the same barons who had murdered Ella Watson. But Ann Bassett wasn't just stealing cattle. She was redistributing wealth. Every cow she rustled went to homesteading families who needed meat to survive mountain winters. And she was doing this while romancing Butch Cassidy and making Pinkerton detectives look like amateurs. Think about the psychological warfare here. And Bassett was operating a criminal enterprise that everyone knew about, that law enforcement couldn't touch, while maintaining social relationships with the most famous outlaws in American history. The winter of 1887 changed everything. That winter killed 90% of the open-range cattle that had made the big barons rich. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for months. Snow fell until it was taller than houses. Cattle died by the thousands, but the Norwegian women who had immigrated to Montana and the Dakotas, they survived. Women like Carrie Moen had been preparing for winters like this their entire lives. Root cellars that could preserve food for years. Techniques for reading blizzard signs in the flight patterns of birds. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to survive in environments that killed everything weak. Think about what that winter proved. All the cattle barons' money, all their political connections, all their hired guns couldn't protect them from weather that Norwegian women took in stride. Survival wasn't about power, it was about knowledge. And women had been accumulating survival knowledge while men had been accumulating power. Mexican sheep-herding families were proving the same point across the mountain. West, families dominated by matriarchs like Refugio Silva controlled high pastures from Colorado to Montana, and their rifle-armed daughters were protecting flocks against cattlemen's raids. These weren't casual conflicts. This was economic warfare fought with Winchester rifles at 11,000 feet elevation. Refugio Silva's daughters were outgunning professional gunfighters while managing livestock operations that fed entire territories. They were proving that competence with violence and competence with business weren't mutually exclusive. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914 brought this violence to its inevitable conclusion. Mining companies had been exploiting workers for decades, and when the miners finally organized to demand basic human rights, the companies responded with machine guns. Mary Petrucci and other mining wives found themselves leading children through machine gun fire as Colorado. National Guard units fired into tent colonies where mining families were living. Think about that moment. You're a mother, your husband is on strike for the right to be paid in real money instead of company scrip, and soldiers are shooting at your children. Mary Petrucci didn't just survive the Ludlow Massacre. She traveled to Washington, D.C. and testified before Congress about what John D. Rockefeller's hired killers were doing to mining families. She stood in the United States Capitol and described watching soldiers burn tent cities while children screamed inside. That testimony helped create the first federal labor protections in American history. Mary Petrucci took the worst thing that had ever happened to her community and turned it into legislation that protected workers across the entire country. But not all mountain women were fighting corporate power. Some were becoming legends for entirely different reasons. Martha Jane Cannery, better known as Calamity Jane, was drinking, swearing, and scouting through the Black Hills while secretly supporting dozens of orphaned children. Think about the contradiction there. Calamity Jane's public persona was everything Victorian society said women shouldn't be. She wore men's clothes, she drank like a man, she fought like a man. But privately, she was doing what Victorian society said women should do, caring for children who had no one else. Calamity. Jane was supporting those orphans with money she earned scouting for the U.S. Army. She was navigating through hostile territory, reading tracks, predicting weather, keeping cavalry units alive in country that could kill experienced soldiers. And she was doing it all while maintaining a secret maternal life that nobody knew about until after she died. Mary Fields, stagecoach. Mary was rewriting the rules about what African-American women could do in the Mountain West. She was the first African-American woman with a United States postal contract, delivering mail through Montana blizzards that stopped everyone else. But Stagecoach Mary wasn't just delivering mail. She was maintaining law and order on mail routes where federal authority meant nothing. She was shooting wolves that threatened her horses and bandits that threatened her cargo with equal accuracy. Think about that responsibility. The entire communication system for huge sections of Montana territory depended on one woman's ability to stay alive in conditions that killed professional soldiers. Mormon polygamous wives were fighting their own war against federal authority. When federal marshals started arresting polygamous husbands, the wives established underground railroads that moved sister wives and children through box canyons, where plural marriage could continue despite federal threats. These women were creating hidden communities in some of the most remote terrain in America. They were raising children, managing households, and maintaining religious practices while evading federal agents who were trying to destroy their way of life. Think about the logistical complexity of that operation. You're moving entire families through mountain wilderness while keeping them fed, clothed, and educated. By 1900, mountain women had proven something that changed American history. They weren't just surviving in the peaks, they were commanding private armies. They were controlling water rights worth millions of dollars. They were enforcing their own justice when federal law failed to reach above 10,000 feet. The mountains had created a new kind of American woman, a woman who could negotiate with corporate executives in the morning and shoot claim jumpers in the afternoon. A woman who could deliver babies during blizzards and testify before Congress about government massacres. But the 20th century was coming. And with it, changes that would challenge everything these women had built. The question wasn't whether mountain women could adapt to modernity. The question was whether modernity could adapt to mountain women. 1900. The new century arrives in the mountains with telegraph lines and railroad tracks, bringing the outside world to places that had been writing their own rules for 50 years. But here's what gets me about this period. Instead of being overwhelmed by modernization, mountain women grabbed these new technologies and used them to build empires. Margaret Molly Brown had become famous for surviving the Titanic, but that was just her opening act. She used that fame like a weapon, leveraging her celebrity to champion miners' rights in congressional hearings where politicians had to listen because the newspapers were watching. Think about the strategic brilliance there. Molly Brown could have retired on her Titanic survivor story, giving speeches to society ladies about the night the unsinkable ship went down. Instead, she turned that fame into political power, fighting for the men who were dying in Colorado mines so that Eastern investors could get richer. But Molly Brown was thinking even bigger than labor politics. She was funding scientific expeditions into the high country, supporting research that would eventually create the national park system. She understood that the mountains weren't just places to extract wealth from. They were places that had value in themselves, value that needed protecting. Meanwhile, Josephine Hensley was revolutionizing mountaineering from her workshop in Denver. She invented the zigzag stitch that made lightweight, weatherproof tents possible for the first time in human history. Think about what that innovation meant. Suddenly, people could carry shelter that wouldn't collapse under the weight of mountain snow, wouldn't tear in 60-mile-per-hour winds, wouldn't freeze solid in sub-zero temperatures. Josephine Hensley's tents made modern mountaineering possible. Every expedition to Everest, every assault on Denali, every high-altitude rescue operation depends on technology that started in a Colorado woman's workshop in 1903. Catherine Root understood that if mountain women were going to protect their interests in the new century, they needed political representation. She mobilized mountain women's votes and became Colorado's first female legislator, proving that women who had learned to negotiate with claim jumpers could certainly handle state politicians. But Catherine Root's real genius was understanding that mountain politics were different from city politics. In Denver, you could win elections with money and connections. In the mountains, you won elections by proving you could keep communities alive when everything tried to kill them. Dr. Susan Anderson, Doc Susie, was proving that point every single day in Fraser, Colorado. She was performing surgery by kerosene lamp in the middle of blizzards, hiking through 6-foot snowdrifts to deliver babies, amputating frost-bitten limbs with tools she sterilized over wood fires. Think about the medical challenges Doc Susie was facing. She was practicing medicine at 9,000 feet elevation, where her instruments froze if she didn't keep them warm with body heat. She was treating injuries and diseases that medical schools didn't teach because they only existed in environments where human beings weren't supposed to survive. And she was doing it all alone. No hospital staff, no medical colleagues to consult, no specialists to call in for difficult cases. Just one woman, her knowledge, and her determination to keep mountain communities alive against impossible odds. Japanese picture brides like Sune Nakamura were transforming barren mountainsides into agricultural miracles. They were creating terraced gardens that produced vegetables for mining camps that had been surviving on canned beans and hardtack. Think about the cultural revolution those gardens represented. These Japanese women weren't just growing food. They were introducing Asian agricultural techniques that tripled crop yields in soil that everyone said was worthless. They were proving that the problem with mountain farming wasn't the mountains, it was that nobody had been using the right methods. Greek women were making similar contributions with livestock and dairy products. They were introducing goat cheese and dandelion wine to communities that had never tasted fresh dairy or alcohol that didn't come from a bottle. These weren't luxury items. In mining camps where scurvy could kill you and bad water could destroy entire communities, these women were literally saving lives with food, knowledge their grandmothers had passed down. The creation of national parks brought new opportunities for women who understood that outsiders would pay good money to experience what locals took for granted. Elizabeth Burnell established Yosemite's first photography studio, and she wasn't just taking tourist pictures. Elizabeth Burnell was documenting the American wilderness in photographs that would influence conservation policy for the next century. When Ansel Adams arrived in Yosemite years later, he learned about mountain light from techniques that Elizabeth Burnell had developed. She was creating the visual language that taught America what its wilderness actually looked like. Jenny Lake became Grand Teton's first female climbing guide, taking Eastern tourists up peaks that had never been climbed by anyone except native hunting parties. But Jenny Lake wasn't just guiding climbs. She was teaching wilderness survival to people who had never been more than 20 miles from the nearest hospital. Think about the responsibility there. You're leading people into environments that can kill them in dozens of different ways, and their survival depends entirely on your knowledge and judgment. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and someone dies. Jenny Lake was carrying that responsibility every single day for decades. Then Prohibition arrived, and mountain women discovered that laws made in Washington, D.C. meant absolutely nothing above 10,000 feet. Josephine Doody was running whiskey from her Burnham, Colorado ranch through a network that included Methodist church basements, mining company offices, and federal courthouse cellars. The genius of Josephine Doody's operation was understanding that everybody wanted illegal alcohol, including the people whose job it was to enforce prohibition. She wasn't fighting the law, she was providing a service that made the law irrelevant. But 1918 brought a different kind of challenge. The influenza pandemic was killing people faster than mountain communities could bury them, and traditional medicine was useless against a disease that nobody understood. Native healers like Maria Martinez started sharing ancient remedies with white communities for the first time in generations. Pine needle tea that prevented scurvy, willow bark that reduced fever, herbal combinations that had been treating respiratory diseases for centuries. Think about what it meant for Maria Martinez to make that decision. Her people had been betrayed, murdered, and displaced by white settlers. She could have watched those communities die and called it justice. Instead, she chose to save lives, to share knowledge, to build bridges in the middle of a pandemic that was destroying everything. Finish. Women were challenging mining company monopolies by establishing cooperative stores that sold goods at actual cost instead of inflated company prices. Women like Aili Lamy were organizing consumer boycotts that shut down corporate price-fixing operations across the Mountain West. These weren't small-scale protests. The Finnish cooperatives were handling millions of dollars in transactions, providing entire communities with alternatives to company exploitation. They were proving that working-class women could organize complex economic operations that competed with corporate power. Italian women like Rosa Casatari were organizing strikes that shut down copper production from Colorado to Montana. They were coordinating labor actions across hundreds of miles of mountain terrain, using networks that included mining wives, boarding house operators, and small business owners. The strike that Rosa Casatari organized in 1912 involved 15,000 workers across 7 states. Think about the logistical complexity of coordinating that kind of action before modern communications. She was managing a military-scale operation using nothing but word of mouth and personal relationships. The Forest Service was hiring its first female fire lookouts, putting women like Hallie Daggett alone on mountain peaks with the responsibility for protecting millions of acres of wilderness. Hallie Daggett spent 15 seasons on Klamath Peak, spotting fires before they could spread, coordinating firefighting efforts across territories larger than most eastern states. Think about the isolation of that work. You're alone on a mountain peak for months at a time, responsible for an area of land that contains entire ecosystems, entire watersheds, entire communities of people and animals. Your vigilance is all that stands between those communities and total destruction by wildfire. By 1920, mountain women had created something unprecedented in American history. They had built a parallel economy, a parallel political system, and a parallel social structure that operated by rules they had written themselves. But the 1920s were about to bring changes that would test everything they had built. The Great Depression was coming, and with it, challenges that would require every skill mountain women had learned about survival, adaptation, and building something from nothing. The question wasn't whether they could survive economic collapse. The question was whether they could turn economic collapse into opportunity. And if their history was any guide, they were about to prove that disaster and opportunity were often the same thing. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday hits Wall Street like an avalanche, and suddenly the entire American economy is collapsing faster than anyone thought possible. But here's what gets me about the Great Depression in the Mountain West. While cities were starving and breadlines stretched around city blocks, mountain communities were discovering that they had been preparing for economic collapse their entire lives. Think about what the Depression meant in places that had already been surviving on nothing. When you've been growing your own food, making your own clothes, and building your own shelter for 50 years, the collapse of the cash economy isn't the end of the world. It's Tuesday. Dorothea Lange was driving through the Sierra Nevada, documenting migrant families fleeing the Dust Bowl, when she discovered something that challenged everything Americans thought they knew about poverty. Mountain women weren't just surviving the Depression, they were thriving. The famous photograph of the migrant mother that became the symbol of Depression-era suffering. That woman wasn't starving because she didn't know how to find food. She was starving because she had left a place where she knew how to survive and traveled to a place where survival depended on cash money that nobody had. Meanwhile, women in mountain communities were teaching civilian Conservation Corps boys from eastern cities how to survive in environments where their urban skills meant nothing. Think about that role reversal. Young men who had grown up thinking they were sophisticated urbanites were learning wilderness survival from women who had never seen a movie theater. Eleanor Roosevelt was visiting mountain communes where women had created what she called alternative family structures. These weren't hippie communes. This was 1935. These were pragmatic arrangements where women shared children, gardens, and sometimes husbands because individual nuclear families couldn't survive mountain isolation. Eleanor Roosevelt was fascinated by these arrangements because they proved that the American family could adapt to economic and geographic challenges in ways that conventional morality said were impossible. These mountain women were writing new rules about marriage, parenting, and community organization that wouldn't be accepted in mainstream America for another 50 years. But the 1940s brought challenges that tested mountain women in ways they had never experienced. Pearl Harbor changed everything, and suddenly the federal government was treating the Mountain West like a strategic resource that needed defending. Japanese internment emptied mountain communities overnight. Families that had been building businesses and raising children in places like Colorado and Utah were loaded onto trains and shipped to concentration camps. But some mountain women refused to let their neighbors disappear. Margaret Fukuoka was a white rancher's wife who risked federal imprisonment hiding Japanese neighbors in root cellars and abandoned mine shafts. Think about the courage that required. The federal government was arresting American citizens for the crime of being Japanese. And Margaret Fukuoka was committing felonies to protect people whose only crime was looking like the enemy. She wasn't the only one. Across the Mountain West, women were hiding Japanese families, maintaining their property and preserving their businesses while the federal government was trying to erase their existence. These weren't grand political gestures. These were personal decisions by women who understood that when the government started disappearing, your neighbors, your community wasn't safe. World War II transformed mountain communities in other ways too. With men overseas fighting, women found themselves running entire counties. Betty Payette was managing 17,000 acres of Montana timber while pregnant with her fourth child, revolutionizing sustainable forestry practices that are still used today. Think about what Betty Payette was doing. She was running logging operations that required coordinating hundreds of workers across terrain that could kill experienced lumberjacks. She was negotiating contracts with federal agencies while managing selective cutting programs that maintained forest health. And she was doing it all while raising 3 children and carrying a 4th, the Boeing aircraft factories. Hidden in mountain valleys were employing thousands of women assembling bomber parts in facilities disguised as barns. These women were building the aircraft that were winning World War II while living in communities that officially didn't exist. The security requirements meant these women couldn't tell their families what they were doing. They were going to work every day to build weapon systems that would determine the outcome of global warfare. And they had to pretend they were working in normal factories, making normal products. German prisoners of war were being shipped to mountain work camps. And widowed ranchers like Helen Muller were discovering that the enemy looked a lot like the neighbors who had been killed in Europe. Some of these relationships led to marriages after the war ended, creating international families in communities that had been completely isolated just a few years earlier. Think about the emotional complexity Helen Muller was navigating. Her husband had been killed fighting Germans in France, and now she was employing German prisoners to keep her ranch running. She was supposed to hate these men, but she needed them to survive. And some of them were kind, intelligent, homesick boys who reminded her more of her dead husband than of the enemy who had killed him. The atomic age brought new horrors to mountain communities. Uranium mining was creating jobs in places like Colorado and Utah, but the companies were concealing radiation dangers from miners' families. Women like Emma Yazzie were watching their husbands die from mysterious diseases that doctors couldn't explain. Emma Yazzie and other Navajo women spent decades fighting for compensation from mining companies and federal agencies that had knowingly exposed their families to deadly radiation. They were battling corporate lawyers and government bureaucrats who had classified information about radiation dangers while their husbands coughed. Blood and died, the legal battles these women fought established precedents for environmental justice that protect millions of Americans today. Emma Yazzie didn't just fight for compensation. She fought for disclosure laws that require companies to tell workers when they're being exposed to hazardous materials. The 1960s brought a different kind of invasion to mountain communities. Television was arriving, showing mountain women images of suburban prosperity that made their lives look primitive by comparison. But instead of being intimidated by these images, many mountain women saw business opportunities. They started packaging authentic mountain crafts for tourists who wanted to buy pre-industrial authenticity. Hand-woven blankets, carved wooden furniture, pottery made from local clay. Products that had been everyday necessities became luxury items that urban consumers would pay premium prices to own. Think about the irony there. Things that mountain women had been making because they couldn't afford store-bought alternatives suddenly became more expensive than store-bought alternatives because they represented a way of life that television had taught urban Americans to romanticize. Mountain communes were attracting beatnik women fleeing suburban conformity, establishing alternative communities where children ran naked and marijuana grew beside tomatoes. These weren't traditional mountain women, but they were learning from traditional mountain women about living off the land, building with local materials, and surviving without depending on the cash economy. The cultural exchange was fascinating. Urban women with college educations were learning subsistence skills from mountain women who had never finished elementary school. And the mountain women were learning about art, literature, and political activism from the urban refugees. By 1960, interstate highways were slicing through communities that had existed in relative isolation since the 1840s. Women were having to choose between modernization and extinction. Some communities embraced the highways, building tourist businesses and welcoming the outside world. Others fought development, trying to preserve ways of life that were becoming impossible to maintain. The highways brought opportunities, but they also brought problems. Drug dealers were discovering that remote mountain communities were perfect places to establish methamphetamine laboratories. Property developers were buying up ranches that families had owned for generations, turning agricultural land into ski resorts and vacation home developments. Mountain women found themselves fighting battles their grandmothers couldn't have imagined. Instead of fighting claim jumpers and cattle barons, they were fighting environmental lawyers and zoning boards. Instead of defending their property with Winchester rifles, they were defending their communities with environmental impact studies and historical preservation applications. But they were still fighting. They were still refusing to let outsiders destroy what generations of mountain women had built. And they were still proving that adaptation and resistance weren't opposites. They were the same thing. The question wasn't whether mountain communities could survive modernization. The question was whether they could control modernization. Whether they could take the benefits of the modern world without losing the independence that had made survival possible in the first place. The 1970s were about to provide some answers, and those answers were going to surprise everyone. 1970. The environmental movement is exploding across America, but in the mountains, women who had been practicing conservation for a century were watching newcomers discover what they called ecology, as if it was something new. The irony was incredible. Urban environmentalists were lecturing mountain women about living in harmony with nature, while those same mountain women had been keeping ecosystems alive for generations. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of resenting the environmental movement, many mountain women embraced it as the first time anyone had given them credit for knowledge they'd been accumulating since childhood. Dolores LaChapelle was living in a cabin outside Silverton, Colorado, developing what she called deep ecology, the idea that mountains, rivers and forests possessed consciousness and deserved legal rights. This wasn't abstract philosophy to Dolores LaChapelle. She had been living alone in the high country for decades, and she was absolutely convinced that the landscape was aware of her presence. Think about what it meant for someone to spend that much time in complete solitude above treeline. Dolores LaChapelle wasn't just studying ecology, she was experiencing it as a spiritual practice, as a way of understanding consciousness that had nothing to do with human intelligence. Her writings influenced environmental policy for the next 50 years. The legal concept of giving rights to natural features, which seems revolutionary to us, came directly from a mountain woman who had learned to listen to what the peaks were telling her. But not all mountain women were embracing environmental ideology. The American Indian movement was sending warrior women like Madonna Thunderhawk to reclaim sacred sites that had been stolen for tourist attractions. These weren't environmental issues to Native women. These were religious freedom issues. Madonna Thunderhawk was occupying Mount Rushmore, demanding that the federal government return the Black Hills to the Lakota people, who considered those peaks sacred. She was pointing out that you couldn't talk about environmental protection while ignoring the genocide that had removed indigenous people from the landscapes they had been protecting for thousands of years. Think about the complexity of that argument. Environmental groups were trying to preserve wilderness areas by removing human influence. But Native women were arguing that human influence, the right kind of human influence, was what had kept those areas healthy in the first place. Corporate mining was returning to the mountains with open-pit operations that could swallow entire towns. Companies like Peabody Coal were planning to strip mine areas larger than some eastern states. And women like Sarah Fields were discovering that they needed law degrees to fight bulldozers. Sarah Fields learned environmental law by reading legal textbooks. At night, after working ranching jobs during the day, she was representing her community in federal court against teams of corporate lawyers who had been expecting to deal with ignorant mountain folk who would be intimidated by legal procedures. Instead, they found themselves facing a woman who understood their legal strategies better than they did, who had spent her entire life learning how to outthink opponents who underestimated her. Sarah Fields won cases that legal experts said were impossible to win, protecting ancestral graves from cyanide, leaching and preserving watersheds that supported entire ecosystems. The farm crisis of the 1980s was destroying mountain communities in ways that the Great Depression hadn't touched. Families were losing centennial ranches to banks that were foreclosing on land that had been supporting the same families for 5 generations. The suicide rate among rural women tripled during the farm crisis. Think about what that statistic represents. These weren't women who had been raised to give up when things got difficult. These were women whose grandmothers had survived blizzards that killed cattle, droughts that lasted for years, economic collapses that destroyed entire industries. But losing the land itself, that was different. That was losing identity, losing purpose, losing the thing that had made survival meaningful. Carole King was one of the urban refugees moving to Idaho during this period, buying a ranch and inspiring thousands of other city dwellers to seek authentic lives in the mountains. But locals like Nadine Bailey were watching property values skyrocket beyond what working families could afford, seeing their children priced out of communities where their families had lived for generations. The irony was brutal. Urban refugees were moving to the mountains to escape the economic pressures of city life. But their arrival was creating the same economic pressures in communities that had been insulated from them for a century. Nadine Bailey found herself bridging divides that seemed impossible to cross. She was working with environmental groups to develop sustainable forestry practices that could support both spotted owls and logging families. Think about the complexity of that negotiation. You're trying to preserve ecosystems while preserving communities, trying to protect wildlife while protecting the livelihoods of people who depend on that wildlife's habitat. The spotted owl controversies of the 1990s forced mountain communities to confront questions that had no good answers. Environmental groups were demanding complete logging bans to protect endangered species. Logging families were demanding the right to continue work that had supported their communities for generations. Women like Nadine Bailey were proposing solutions that nobody wanted to hear. Selective cutting instead of clear cutting. Sustainable harvest instead of maximum extraction. Long-term forest health instead of short-term profits. These weren't radical environmental positions or radical economic positions. They were practical compromises that required everyone to give up something they wanted. But the 1990s brought a different kind of crisis that made environmental debate seem manageable by comparison. Methamphetamine was arriving in mountain communities, and it was destroying families faster than any economic crisis or environmental disaster had ever done. Women like Dr. Mary Holly were establishing intervention programs in barns and church basements, trying to treat addiction in communities that had no medical infrastructure, no social services, and no experience dealing with synthetic drugs that created dependencies unlike anything they had seen before. Think about what Dr. Mary Holly was facing. She was treating meth addiction in communities where the nearest hospital was 200 miles away, where law enforcement consisted of one part-time sheriff, where the social isolation that had once protected mountain families was now enabling drug dealers who could operate without interference. The militia movement was attracting mountain women who feared that federal overreach was destroying the independence that had made mountain life possible. These weren't abstract political fears. These women had watched federal agencies take their neighbors' children, seize their neighbors' property, and dictate how they could use land their families had owned for generations. Ruby Ridge changed everything. When federal agents surrounded Randy Weaver's mountain cabin in 1892, when they killed his wife Vicky while she was holding their baby daughter, mountain communities across the West understood that their isolation wouldn't protect them from a government that had decided they were enemies. Think about what Ruby Ridge represented to mountain women. Vicky Weaver had been living the same kind of independent life that mountain women had been living for over a century. She was homeschooling her children, growing her own food, and trying to live by her own values without bothering anyone else. And federal agents had killed her for it. The Ruby Ridge siege traumatized entire generations of mountain families, creating a level of distrust between mountain communities and federal authority that persists today. Women who had been raising their children to be self-reliant and independent were suddenly wondering whether those same qualities would make their families targets. By 2000, mountain women were facing an impossible choice. They could sell their heritage to survive, turning family ranches into tourist destinations, marketing their traditional crafts to urban consumers. performing authenticity for people who romanticized the hardships they had actually lived through. Or they could fight to preserve ways of life that were becoming economically impossible to maintain. Some chose survival. They opened bed and breakfasts in houses their great-grandmothers had built. They taught wilderness skills to corporate executives on team-building retreats. They sold their stories to filmmakers who turned their family histories into entertainment for urban audiences who would never understand what those stories had actually cost. Others chose resistance. They organized land trusts to keep family properties from being sold to developers. They fought zoning changes that would have transformed agricultural communities into bedroom suburbs. They established schools that taught traditional skills alongside modern curricula, trying to preserve knowledge that was disappearing faster than the communities that had created it. But both choices required the same skills that mountain women had been developing for over a century. Adaptation without surrender, innovation without abandonment of core values, survival without compromise of identity. The new millennium was about to test those skills in ways that no previous generation could have imagined. 2000. The digital revolution arrives in the mountains through satellite internet and cell phone towers, connecting communities that had been isolated for centuries to a global economy that operates at the speed of light. But here's what gets me about this moment. Instead of being overwhelmed by digital technology, mountain women grabbed it and used it to scale up everything they had been doing locally. Think about the transformation this represented. Women who had been selling quilts at county fairs were suddenly running Etsy empires that reached customers on 6 continents. Traditional crafts that had been valued at $50 in local markets were selling for $500 to urban consumers who were hungry for authentic handmade products. Rebecca Martinez was teaching traditional food preservation techniques to urban preppers. Through YouTube videos that got millions of views, she was taking knowledge that her grandmother had considered basic survival skills and turning it into digital content that generated more income than her family ranch had ever produced. But Rebecca Martinez wasn't just monetizing traditional knowledge, she was preserving it. Every video she made was documentation of skills that were disappearing as older generations died and younger generations moved to cities. She was creating a digital library of mountain survival techniques that would outlast the communities that had developed them. The prepper movement was bringing thousands of urban refugees to mountain communities, and women like Rebecca Martinez found themselves teaching city dwellers basic skills like canning vegetables, reading weather patterns, and identifying edible plants. Think about that role reversal. People with advanced degrees and 6-figure salaries were paying to learn skills that mountain women had considered elementary education. Climate change was transforming mountain ecosystems faster than anyone had predicted. Women scientists like Dr. Diana Tombak were fighting to save whitebark pine forests that had fed indigenous communities for thousands of years. These weren't just environmental issues, they were cultural preservation issues. Dr. Diana Tombak was coordinating conservation efforts across multiple states, working with tribal leaders, federal agencies, and private landowners to protect tree species that were keystone components of high-altitude ecosystems. She was racing against time, trying to preserve seed sources for forests that might not survive the warming climate but might be able to re-establish themselves if temperatures ever stabilized. Think about the scale of what Dr. Diana Tombak was attempting. She was trying to preserve entire ecosystems, while those ecosystems were changing faster than scientific models could predict. She was making decisions about which species to prioritize, which habitats to protect, which genetic lines to preserve. Decisions that would determine what high-altitude wilderness would look like for the next 1,000 years. Instagram was transforming anonymous mountain peaks into selfie destinations, bringing thousands of tourists to places that had been accessible only to experienced mountaineers. Women like Ashley Tyndall were watching their childhood hiking trails turn into traffic jams, their secret fishing spots turn into parking lots, their sacred places turn into photo opportunities for people who would never understand their spiritual significance. Ashley Tyndall found herself balancing economic opportunity against cultural preservation in ways her grandmother never could have imagined. Tourism was bringing money to mountain communities that desperately needed economic development. But that same tourism was destroying the wilderness solitude that had made mountain life meaningful in the first place. She started guiding small groups to lesser-known locations, teaching wilderness ethics alongside outdoor skills, trying to create tourism that enhanced rather than destroyed the places tourists came to experience. Think about the complexity of that balance. You need tourism revenue to maintain your community, but too much tourism destroys what tourists come to see. Marijuana legalization was bringing a different kind of economic opportunity to mountain communities. Women like Jasmine Hupp were establishing cannabis cultivation operations in places that had been economically devastated by mining busts and agricultural decline. Jasmine Hupp was applying traditional mountain farming knowledge to cannabis cultivation, using techniques her grandmother had developed for growing vegetables in short seasons and harsh conditions. She was creating strains adapted to high-altitude environments, building a business that combined century-old agricultural wisdom with modern botanical science. But the cannabis industry was also attracting criminal organizations and outside investment that threatened to repeat the same exploitation patterns that had destroyed mountain communities during previous resource booms. Women like Jasmine Hupp were fighting to maintain local control over an industry that could either revitalize their communities or destroy them completely. Tech billionaires were buying legacy ranches, turning working agricultural operations into vacation properties for people who could afford to pay $20 million for mountain views. But some of those billionaires, like Mackenzie Scott, were also funding programs that supported generational ranching families who were trying to maintain traditional ways of life. Think about the contradictions this created. The same tech wealth that was pricing working families out of mountain communities was also funding conservation programs that preserved those communities' cultural heritage. The same global economy that was destroying traditional livelihoods was also creating markets for traditional products. COVID-19 accelerated these contradictions to an extreme degree. Millions of people were fleeing cities for mountain communities, working remotely from places that had been isolated by geography for over a century. Property values exploded. Housing shortages became housing crises. Local women found themselves unable to afford rent in communities where their families had lived for generations. But the same pandemic that was displacing local families was also creating unprecedented demand for traditional mountain skills. Urban refugees were desperate to learn food preservation, off-grid living, and wilderness survival, skills that mountain women had been maintaining while the rest of America had forgotten them. Young women like Miriam Lancewood were choosing radical simplicity, living in caves and hunting with primitive weapons, teaching survival skills to smartphone-addicted teenagers who had never spent a night without electricity. Think about what Miriam Lancewood represented. She was choosing to live like her great-great-grandmother had lived, not because she had to, but because she believed that way of life offered something that modern civilization couldn't provide. Miriam Lancewood wasn't rejecting technology completely. She was using social media to document her primitive lifestyle, creating content that reached millions of people who were questioning whether technological progress had actually improved human life. She was proving that you could choose ancient ways while remaining connected to modern conversations. Native women were reclaiming ancestral names for mountain peaks while establishing indigenous-led conservation programs that protected sacred sites from development. Women like Darren Walker were combining traditional ecological knowledge with modern conservation science, creating land management programs that preserved both cultural heritage and environmental health. These weren't symbolic gestures. Indigenous-led conservation programs were protecting millions of acres of critical habitat, while providing economic opportunities for tribal communities that had been marginalized for centuries. Native women were proving that cultural preservation and environmental protection weren't separate goals. They were the same goal. Approached from different angles, the script reaches its conclusion as dawn breaks over peaks, where the cycle continues. Mountain women are still gathering medicinal herbs by moonlight, following knowledge passed down through dozens of generations. They're still birthing babies in cabins that their great-grandmothers built with their own hands. They're still teaching daughters that mountains demand everything from those who choose to live among them, but give immortality to those brave enough to answer their call. But now they're also live-streaming traditional craft techniques to global audiences, using satellite internet to coordinate conservation efforts across international borders, and building business empires that span continents while remaining rooted in specific places, specific communities, specific relationships with landscapes that shape them. The mountains are still creating new kinds of women. Women who can troubleshoot solar panel installations and track elk through snow. Women who can negotiate million-dollar business deals and deliver babies during blizzards. Women who can design smartphone apps and identify edible plants in the dark. Mountain women's story continues wherever human beings dare to wrestle paradise from stone. Their legacy is written in avalanche lilies that bloom through snow. In golden eagles that circle peaks, their spirits refuse to abandon. In daughters who carry forward traditions that adapt without surrendering, that change without forgetting, that face whatever future the mountains demand with the same courage their ancestors brought to challenges no one thought could be survived. The peaks remain. The women remain. And the story continues, written in stone and storm, in blood and birth, in the eternal conversation between human determination and the mountains that test it, refine it, and ultimately crown it with the kind of immortality that only comes from refusing to surrender to anything, including death itself. That's the story of mountain women. That's the story of America. And that's the story that's still being written every time a woman looks at an impossible peak and decides that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet.